It sounds more democratic, but what it effectively does is it insulates the party leader from having to be accountable at all to his or her caucus. And it seems to me, in a parliamentary system, if we think Parliament matters, and a lot of these things become self-reinforcing loops, but if you think Parliament matters, the decisions and the debates that happen in Parliament matter and should matter, then my submission would be the leader should be the leader of that caucus and should be accountable to that caucus and should be awfully solicitous of that caucus's concerns and the MP's concerns, because if he isn't, he's going to be out in his ear. Whereas when we have the leader chosen by this kind of Bonapartist model of you're elected at large and then every few years you're reconfirmed by 90% votes of the membership, I think we've lost an essential check on the power of the party leader vis-a-vis his caucus and his party. And when we get that kind of resulting party discipline and the meaninglessness of the average MP's role, is it any wonder they behave so abominably? That is, you're watching human nature in the wild here. When people are deprived of any meaning and purpose in their lives, in whatever walk of life, they start to act up out of despair. When people have real responsibilities, when they've got jobs that matter and stakes that are, and they're tied into real responsibilities, then they sober up and they smarten up and they behave like adults. Now, part of the problem also with party discipline, I have to say, is the MPs themselves have bought into this too much. They need at some point to discover a bit of backbone and start defying their party leadership. And too many of them have been too willing to kind of toe the line for a couple reasons. In the particular case of the Tories, because they're so desperate to get to the majority and they've all been told, don't rock the boat, don't make any waves, for God's sakes don't say what you actually believe about anything, because we have to keep that under wraps so that we can get to the majority. But what's true of all parties and all governments is, in our country, is we have a cabinet that is the largest cabinet in the Western world. We now have it up to 37 ministers. Okay? The United States of America, you know, with 300 million people and the fate of the free world, they have 15 cabinet ministers. Typically you'll get maybe 20 in a lot of other democracies. I think Britain has one of the larger ones with 26. We have 37. The caucus, the governing caucus, is presently, I believe, about 140 odd MPs. So that means if you keep your nose clean, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of getting into cabinet. And by keeping your nose clean, I mean obeying central command. And so the incentive structures are all on. Now compare that to Great Britain, with a caucus of 26, let's say, and I should say a cabinet of 26, and a governing caucus typically of 400 odd. Which means you have about a 1 in 20 chance of getting into cabinet, which means there are lots and lots of MPs in Great Britain who are never, ever, ever going to get into cabinet, and they know it. And so what do? They become useful MPs. They do what MPs are supposed to do. They represent their ridings. They voice their conscience. They bring skills and knowledge to the debates. They bone up on subject matters, become experts on a particular subject matter. They create useful mischief in Parliament by voting down legislation that they don't like, even if it's from their party. They do what the system is supposed to do. And in Britain, I should tell you, they're concerned that there's too much party discipline there. It's, you know, it's just nothing like the same degree. We have allowed the role of the MP to be degraded, as I say, not just into a $140,000 voting machine, but when we start trying to give them things to do, we corrupt their responsibility because we start involving them in things like spending. So we have MPs showing up at spending announcements, and famously holding those giant-sized novelty checks. Well, that's not their job. Their job is supposed to be watchdogs, even if they're members of the government, on the government themselves, even if they're members of that party. They're supposed to be a watchdog on the government, and to show you how things have changed in this country. And I'm not necessarily advocating this, but it's a wonderful, I love the spirit behind it. Up until World War II, if you were appointed to cabinet, and I speak as somebody who was a member of the governing parties, of the ordinary run of things, you had to resign your seat and run the by-election. Now, as I say, a little bit impractical because at a couple of critical moments in Canadian history when governments had very narrow majorities, they would appoint a cabinet and lose their majority because they'd all have to resign and run a by-election. So it had certain practical drawbacks. But think about the thinking behind it. The thinking was your role had changed. You had gone from being a watchdog on the government to being a member of the government. Nothing wrong with that, but you should go back to your electors and ask their permission. And that was the thinking that animated parliamentary democracy in this country, and it shows, as I say, the degree to which it's fallen. So part of what keeps them in line is the ambition of a cabinet post, but of course you get into cabinet with 37 cabinet ministers, and as the political scientist Donald Savoy has remarked, cabinet itself has become a kind of a focus group for the prime minister. Everybody knows that the big decisions are made in the prime minister's office. This is not a partisan shock, because it was exactly the same under the Liberals. And the cabinet ministers themselves, aside from a few, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 at the most, have very little actual independent responsibility. So that has been allowed to degrade as well. When you look at the debates in Parliament and the degree to which Parliament can actually exercise accountability and a check on the executive, that has been allowed to degrade over the years as well. We've allowed a lot of the conventions of British parliamentary democracy, the customs and conventions, maybe not written down, but that are part of the constitution of our country that we've inherited from Britain, we've allowed those to degrade over the years. I'll give you an example. One of the biggest, those of you who are students of Canadian political history will know, one of the biggest political fights we ever had in this country was the 1956 pipeline debate. And I won't bore you with the details of the pipeline itself, but what I'll tell you is what kicked off that weeks-long parliamentary brawl, in the best sense of that term, was that the government had invoked closure. And people were appalled at this. You know, we weren't in wartime, there was no emergency. Why were they cutting off debate? This is what Parliament is supposed to do, is debate things. And the government had invoked closure. Okay, well, flash forward to today. It's called time allocation now, but it's the same thing. Closure is invoked every other week. No one even bats an eye. Why would we get upset just because they cut off debate? Who cares about parliamentary debates? It doesn't matter. Nobody takes it seriously. So we've allowed a lot of these things to degrade over time, measure by measure, each thing setting a precedent that becomes the justification for the next abuse. And you add it all up together, each one of those things might not seem like such a big deal, but when you add it all together, you got a neutered parliament. We have, as I think Peter Russell said, a presidential system without the Congress. You know, we have so much power concentrated in the executive. We don't, as I say, have these kind of decent chaps conventions that made the British system work, where ministers resigned, for example, when they had suffered a severe breakdown in the department. They had notions of ministerial accountability. So we've lost that, and we haven't put in place the more kind of formal institutional checks and balances that are familiar from the American system. So we're kind of betwixt and between. We really have very little check at all on the powers of the Prime Minister. As you may know, the powers that a Prime Minister has in our system, particularly of appointment, where he appoints the senators, he appoints the Supreme Court justices, the federal court justices, he effectively appoints his MPs, and many other powers of appointment as well, crown corporations and so on and so forth, almost all of which have no parliamentary oversight whatsoever. We've begun tentatively to experiment with it with regard to Supreme Court justices. But that is unknown in the Western world, that degree of executive dominance. Last couple points before I get to the how to fix it. I've talked a little bit about how inane our elections are. The really disappointing thing is, because I don't really expect much more from my colleagues in the media or from the party, but we have this great instrument that you'd think would be a departure from that, which is the televised election debates. And we've just seen what an extraordinary impact they had in Great Britain, where they had the 3 debates. Well, what do? In Canada, we have 1 debate in each language, and we segregate them by language so that only part of the country is watching at any one time, rather than all watching it together, since we're all voting together. So we have 1 debate, and it becomes a huge big prize fight, and the candidates are absolutely wired going in, because it's only 1 debate, so much is riding on it. And instead of actually listening to the debate and making the points they're making, and what we're learning about these candidates and their policies, all we're doing is scoring who won. A prize fight. Well, I'm sorry, that's not what we're electing. We're not electing who's got the best, comeback line. We're supposed to be electing people to govern the country. We're supposed to be trying to learn about their character under fire and what they stand for, which I would submit they did learn a lot from the British debates, because there were 3 of them in part.